Welcome to this compilation of 4 sci-fi short stories by the one and only Philip K. Dick. I'll be narrating The Skull, Beyond Lies the Wub, The Eyes Have It, and Piper in the Woods. Before we start, I'd like to let you know that you can get more of my narrations on my Patreon. Every month I publish a new exclusive novelette, and there are quite a few now, by the likes of Ray Bradbury, Evelyn E. Smith, and H. Beam Piper. And subscribers get 6-month early access to all novels I narrate. The most recent one is The Night of the Long Knives by Fritz Leiber. Patreon is a great way to support me as a creator. It helps me keep bringing these stories into the modern world, and you can be a part of that too. Thanks to all my backers who have contributed so much already. But now let's get to the stories, so sit back, relax, and enjoy. The Skull by Philip K. Dick. Narrated by William Skye. Conger agreed to kill a stranger he had never seen, but he would make no mistakes because he had the stranger's skull under his arm. "What is this opportunity?" Conger asked. "Go on, I'm interested." The room was silent. All faces were fixed on Conger, still in the drab prison uniform. The speaker leaned forward slowly. "Before you went to prison, your trading business was paying well. All illegal, all very profitable. Now you have nothing except the prospect of another 6 years in a cell." Conger scowled. "There is a certain situation, very important to this council, that requires your peculiar abilities. Also, it is a situation you might find interesting. You were a hunter, were you not? You've done a great deal of trapping, hiding in the bushes, waiting at night for the game. I imagine hunting must be a source of satisfaction to you, the chase, the stalking." Conger sighed. His lips twisted. "All right," he said, "leave that out. Get to the point. Who do you want me to kill?" The speaker smiled. "All in proper sequence," he said softly. The car slid to a stop. It was night. There was no light anywhere along the street. Conger looked out. "Where are we? What is this place?" The hand of the guard pressed into his arm. "Come, through that door." Conger stepped down onto the damp sidewalk. The guard came swiftly after him, and then the speaker. Conger took a deep breath of the cold air. He studied the dim outline of the building rising up before them. "I know this place. I've seen it before." He squinted, his eyes growing accustomed to the dark. Suddenly he became alert. "This is—" "Yes, the first church." The speaker walked toward the steps. "We're expected." "Expected? Here?" "Yes." The speaker mounted the stairs. "You know we're not allowed in their churches, especially with guns." He stopped. 2 armed soldiers loomed up ahead, one on each side. "All right." The speaker looked up at them. They nodded. The door of the church was open. Conger could see other soldiers inside, standing about, young soldiers with large eyes, gazing at the icons and holy images. "I see," he said. "It was necessary," the speaker said. "As you know, we have been singularly unfortunate in the past in our relations with the First Church." "This won't help." "But it's worth it. You will see." They passed through the hall and into the main chamber where the altarpiece was and the kneeling places. The speaker scarcely glanced at the altar as they passed by. He pushed open a small side door and beckoned Conger through. "In here. We have to hurry. The faithful will be flocking in soon." Conger entered, blinking. They were in a small chamber, low-ceilinged, with dark panels of old wood. There was a smell of ashes and smouldering spices in the room. He sniffed. "What's that? The smell?" "Cups on the wall. I don't know." The speaker crossed impatiently to the far side. "According to our information, it is hidden here by this—" Conger looked around the room. He saw books and papers, holy signs and images. A strange low shiver went through him. "Does my job involve anyone of the church?" "If it does—" The speaker turned astonished. "Can it be that you believe in the founder? Is it possible? A hunter? A killer?" "No, of course not. All their business about resignation to death, non-violence." "What is it then?" Conger shrugged. I've been taught not to mix with such as these. They have strange abilities, and you can't reason with them." The speaker studied Conga thoughtfully. "You have the wrong idea. It is no one here that we have in mind. We found that killing them only tends to increase their numbers." "Then why come here? Let's leave." "No, we came for something important. Something you will need to identify your man. Without it, you won't be able to find him." A trace of a smile crossed the speaker's face. "We don't want you to kill the wrong person. It's too important." "I don't make mistakes." Conga's chest rose. "Listen, speaker, this is an unusual situation," the speaker said. "You see, the person you are after, the person that we are sending you to find, is known only by certain objects here. They are the only traces, the only means of identification. Without them, what are they?" He came toward the speaker. The speaker moved to one side. "Look," he said. He drew a sliding wall away, showing a dark square hole. "In there." Conga squatted down, staring in. He frowned. "A skull, a skeleton." "The man you are after has been dead for 2 centuries, the speaker said. "This is all that remains of him, and this is all you have with which to find him." For a long time Conga said nothing. He stared down at the bones, dimly visible in the recess of the wall. How could a man dead centuries be killed? How could he be stalked, brought down? Conga was a hunter, a man who had lived as he pleased, where he pleased. He had kept himself alive by trading, bringing furs and pelts in from the provinces on his own ship, riding at high speed, slipping through the customs line around Earth. He had hunted in the great mountains of the moon. He had stalked through empty Martian cities. He had explored, the speaker said. "Soldier, take these objects and have them carried to the car. Don't lose any part of them." The soldier went into the cupboard, reaching gingerly, squatting on his heels. "It is my hope," the speaker continued softly to Conga, "that you will demonstrate your loyalty to us now. There are always ways for citizens to restore themselves, to show their devotion to their society. For you, I think this would be a very good chance. I seriously doubt that a better one will come. And for your efforts there will be quite a restitution, of course." The 2 men looked at each other, Conga thin, unkempt, the speaker immaculate in his uniform. "I understand you," Conga said. "I understand this part, about the chance. But how can a man who has been dead 2 centuries be—" "I'll explain later," the speaker said. "Right now we have to hurry." The soldier had gone out with the bones wrapped in a blanket held carefully in his arms. The speaker walked to the door. "Come, they've already discovered that we've broken in here, and they'll be coming at any moment." They hurried down the damp steps to the waiting car. A second later, the driver lifted the car up into the air above the housetops. The speaker settled back in the seat. "The First Church has an interesting past," he said. "I suppose you are familiar with it, but I'd like to speak of a few points that are of relevancy to us. It was in the 20th century that the movement began, during one of the periodic wars. The movement developed rapidly, feeding on the general sense of futility, the realization that each war was breeding greater war, with no end in sight. The movement posed a simple answer to the problem. Without military preparations, weapons, there could be no war. And without machinery and complex scientific technocracy, there could be no weapons. The movement preached that you couldn't stop war by planning for it. They preached that man was losing to his machinery and science, that it was getting away from him, pushing him into greater and greater wars. Down with society, they shouted. Down with factories and science. A few more wars and there wouldn't be much left of the world. The founder was an obscure person from a small town in the American Middle West. We don't even know his name. All we know is that one day he appeared, preaching a doctrine of non-violence, non-resistance, no fighting, no paying taxes for guns, no research except for medicine. Live out your life quietly, tending your garden, staying out of public affairs, mind your own business. Be obscure, unknown, poor. Give away most of your possessions, leave the city. At least that was what developed from what he told the people. The car dropped down and landed on a roof. The founder preached this doctrine, or the germ of it. There's no telling how much the faithful have added themselves. The local authorities picked him up at once, of course. Apparently they were convinced that he meant it. He was never released. He was put to death and his body buried secretly. It seemed that the cult was finished. The speaker smiled. Unfortunately, some of his disciples reported seeing him after the date of his death. The rumor spread. He had conquered death. He was divine. It took hold, grew, and here we are today with the first church obstructing all social progress, destroying society, sowing the seeds of anarchy. But the wars, Conga said. About them? The wars? Well, there were no more wars. It must be acknowledged that the elimination of war was the direct result of non-violence practiced on a general scale. But we can take a more objective view of war today. What was so terrible about it? War had a profound selective value, perfectly in accord with the teachings of Darwin and Mendel and others. Without war, the mass of useless, incompetent mankind, without training or intelligence, is permitted to grow and expand unchecked. War acted to reduce their numbers, like storms and earthquakes and droughts. It was nature's way of eliminating the unfit. Without war, the lower elements of mankind have increased all out of proportion. They threaten the educated few, those with scientific knowledge and training, the ones equipped to direct society. They have no regard for science or a scientific society based on reason. And this movement seeks to aid and abet them. Only when scientists are in full control can the... He looked at his watch and then kicked the car door open. I'll tell you the rest as we walk. They crossed the dark roof. Doubtless you now know whom those bones belong to, who it is that we are after. He has been dead just 2 centuries now, this ignorant man from the Middle West, this founder. The tragedy is that the authorities of the time acted too slowly. They allowed him to speak, to get his message across. He was allowed to preach, to start his cult, and once such a thing is underway, there's no stopping it. But what if he had died before he preached? What if none of his doctrines had ever been spoken? It took only a moment for him to utter them, that we know. They say he spoke just once, just one time. Then the authorities came, taking him away. He offered no resistance. The incident was small. The speaker turned to Conga. Small, but we're reaping the consequences of it today. They went inside the building. Inside, the soldiers had already laid out the skeleton on a table. The soldiers stood around it, their young faces intense. Conga went over to the table, pushing past them. He bent down, staring at the bones. So these are his remains, he murmured. The founder. The church has hidden them for 2 centuries. Quite so, the speaker said, but now we have them. Come along down the hall. They went across the room to a door. The speaker pushed it open. Technicians looked up. Conga saw machinery whirring and turning, benches and retorts. In the center of the room was a gleaming crystal cage. The speaker handed a Slem gun to Conga. The important thing to remember is that the skull must be saved and brought back, for comparison and proof. Aim low, at the chest. Conga weighed the gun in his hands. It feels good, he said. I know this gun, that is, I've seen them before, but I never used one. The speaker nodded. You will be instructed on the use of the gun and the operation of the cage. You will be given all data we have on the time and location. The exact spot was a place called Hudson's Field, about 1960, in a small community outside Denver, Colorado. And don't forget, the only means of identification you will have will be the skull. There are visible characteristics of the front teeth, especially the left incisor. Conga listened absently. He was watching 2 men in white carefully wrapping the skull in a plastic bag. They tied it and carried it into the crystal cage. And if I should make a mistake? Pick the wrong man? Then find the right one. Don't come back until you succeed in reaching this founder. And you can't wait for him to start speaking, that's what we must avoid. You must act in advance. Take chances, shoot as soon as you think you've found him. He'll be someone unusual, probably a stranger in the area. Apparently he wasn't known. Conga listened dimly. Do you think you have it all now? The speaker asked. Yes, I think so. Conga entered the crystal cage and sat down, placing his hands on the wheel. Good luck, the speaker said. We'll be awaiting the outcome. There's some philosophical doubt as to whether one can alter the past. This should answer the question once and for all. Conga fingered the controls of the cage. By the way, the speaker said, don't try to use this cage for purposes not anticipated in your job. We have a constant trace on it. If we want it back, we can get it back. Good luck. Conga said nothing. The cage was sealed. He raised his finger and touched the wheel control. He turned the wheel carefully. He was still staring at the plastic bag when the room outside vanished. For a long time there was nothing at all. Nothing beyond the crystal mesh of the cage. Thoughts rushed through Conga's mind, helter-skelter. How would he know the man? How could he be certain in advance? What had he looked like? What was his name? How had he acted before he spoke? Would he be an ordinary person, or some strange outlandish crank? Conga picked up the Slem gun and held it against his cheek. The metal of the gun was cool and smooth. He practiced moving the sight. It was a beautiful gun, the kind of gun he could fall in love with. If he had owned such a gun in the Martian desert, on the long nights when he had lain cramped and numbed with cold, waiting for things that moved through the darkness. He put the gun down and adjusted the meter readings of the cage. The spiraling mist was beginning to condense and settle. All at once forms wavered and fluttered around him. Colours, sounds, movements filtered through the crystal wire. He clamped the controls off and stood up. He was on a ridge overlooking a small town. It was high noon. The air was crisp and bright. A few automobiles moved along a road. Off in the distance were some level fields. Conga went to the door and stepped outside. He sniffed the air, then he went back into the cage. He stood before the mirror over the shelf, examining his features. He had trimmed his beard, they had not got in to cut it off, and his hair was neat. He was dressed in the clothing of the middle 20th century, the odd collar and coat, the shoes of animal hide. In his pocket was money of the times. That was important. Nothing more was needed. Nothing except his ability, his special cunning. But he had never used it in such a way before. He walked down the road toward the town. The first things he noticed were the newspapers on the stands. April 5th, 1961. He was not too far off. He looked around him. There was a filling station, a garage, some taverns and a 10-cent store. Down the street was a grocery store and some public buildings. A few minutes later he mounted the stairs of the little public library and passed through the doors into the warm interior. The librarian looked up, smiling. "Good afternoon," she said. He smiled, not speaking because his words would not be correct, accented and strange probably. He went over to a table and sat down by a heap of magazines. For a moment he glanced through them. Then he was on his feet again. He crossed the room to a wide rack against the wall. His heart began to beat heavily. Newspapers, weeks on end. He took a roll of them over to the table and began to scan them quickly. The print was odd, the letters strange. Some of the words were unfamiliar. He set the papers aside and searched farther. At last he found what he wanted. He carried the Cherrywood Gazette to the table and opened it to the first page. He found what he wanted. Prisoner hangs self. An unidentified man held by the county sheriff's office for suspicion of criminal syndicalism was found dead this morning by... He finished the item. It was vague, uninforming. He needed more. He carried the Gazette back to the racks and then, after a moment's hesitation, approached the librarian. More, he asked. More papers. Old ones? She frowned. How old? Which papers? Months old. And before. Of the Gazette? This is all we have. What did you want? What are you looking for? Maybe I can help you. He was silent. You might find older issues at the Gazette office, the woman said, taking off her glasses. Why don't you try there? But if you tell me, maybe I could help you. He went out. The Gazette office was down a side street. The sidewalk was broken and cracked. He went inside. A heater glowed in the corner of the small office. A heavy-set man stood up and came slowly over to the counter. What did you want, mister? He said. Old papers. A month or more. To buy? You want to buy them? Yes. He held out some of the money he had. The man stared. Sure, he said. Sure, wait a minute. He went quickly out of the room. When he came back he was staggering under the weight of his armload, his face red. Here are some, he grunted. Took what I could find. Covers the whole year. And if you want more... Conga carried the papers outside. He sat down by the road and began to go through them. What he wanted was 4 months back in December. It was a tiny item, so small that he almost missed it. His hands trembled as he scanned it using the small dictionary for some of the archaic terms. Man arrested for unlicensed demonstration. An unidentified man who refused to give his name was picked up in Cooper Creek by special agent of the sheriff's office, according to Sheriff Duff. It was said the man was recently noticed in this area and had been watched continually. It was Cooper Creek, December 1960. His heart pounded. That was all he needed to know. He stood up, shaking himself, stamping his feet on the cold ground. The sun had moved across the sky to the very edge of the hills. He smiled. Already he had discovered the exact time and place. Now he needed only to go back, perhaps to November, to Cooper Creek. He walked back through the main section of town, past the library, past the grocery store. It would not be hard. The hard part was over. He would go there, rent a room, prepare to wait until the man appeared. He turned the corner. A woman was coming out of a doorway, loaded down with packages. Conga stepped aside to let her pass. The woman glanced at him. Suddenly her face turned white. She stared, her mouth open. Conga hurried on. He looked back. What was wrong with her? The woman was still staring. She had dropped the packages to the ground. He increased his speed. He turned a second corner and went up a side street. When he looked back again, the woman had come to the entrance of the street and was starting after him. A man joined her and the two of them began to run toward him. He lost them and left the town, striding quickly, easily up into the hills at the edge of town. When he reached the cage, he stopped. What had happened? Was it something about his clothing, his dress? He pondered. Then, as the sun set, he stepped into the cage. Conga sat before the wheel. For a moment he waited, his hands resting lightly on the control. Then he turned the wheel just a little, following the control readings carefully. The greyness settled down around him, but not for very long. The man looked him over critically. "You better come inside," he said. "Out of the cold." "Thanks." Conga went gratefully through the open door into the living room. It was warm and close from the heat of the little kerosene heater in the corner. A woman, large and shapeless in her flowered dress, came from the kitchen. She and the man studied him critically. "It's a good room," the woman said. "I'm Mrs. Appleton. It's got heat. You need that this time of year." "Yes," he nodded, looking around. "You want to eat with us?" "What?" "You want to eat with us?" The man's brows knitted. "You're not a foreigner, are you, mister?" "No," he smiled. "I was born in this country. Quite far west, though." "California?" "No," he hesitated. "In Oregon." "What's it like up there?" Mrs. Appleton asked. "I hear there's a lot of trees and green. It's so barren here. I come from Chicago, myself." "That's the Middle West," the man said to her. "You ain't no foreigner." "Oregon isn't foreign either," Conga said. "It's part of the United States." The man nodded absently. He was staring at Conga's clothing. "That's a funny suit you got on, mister," he said. "Where'd you get that?" Conga was lost. He shifted uneasily. "It's a good suit," he said. "Maybe I'd better go some other place if you don't want me here." They both raised their hands protestingly. The woman smiled at him. "We just have to look out for those Reds. You know, the government is always warning us about them." "The Reds?" He was puzzled. "The government says they're all around. We're supposed to report anything strange or unusual, anybody doesn't act normal." "Like me?" They looked embarrassed. "Well, you don't look like a Red to me," the man said, "but we have to be careful. The Tribune says—" Conga half listened. It was going to be easier than he had thought. Clearly he would know as soon as the founder appeared. These people, so suspicious of anything different, would be buzzing and gossiping and spreading the story. All he had to do was lie low and listen, down at the general store perhaps, or even here in Mrs. Appleton's boarding house. "Can I see the room?" he said. "Certainly." Mrs. Appleton went to the stairs. "I'll be glad to show it to you." They went upstairs. It was colder upstairs, but not nearly as cold as outside. Nor as cold as nights on the Martian deserts. For that he was grateful. He was walking slowly around the store, looking at the cans of vegetables, the frozen packages of fish and meat shining and clean in the open refrigerator counters. Ed Davies came toward him. "Can I help you?" he said. The man was a little oddly dressed, and with a beard. Ed couldn't help smiling. "Nothing," the man said in a funny voice. "Just looking." "Sure," Ed said. He walked back behind the counter. Mrs. Hackett was wheeling her cart up. "Who's he?" she whispered, her sharp face turned, her nose moving as if it was sniffing. "I've never seen him before." "I don't know. Looks funny to me. Why does he wear a beard?
No one else wears a beard. Must be something the matter with him.
Maybe he likes to wear a beard. I had an uncle who...
Wait,
Mrs. Hackett stiffened.
Didn't that... What was his name? The red, that old one. Didn't he have a beard? Marx. He had a beard.
Ed laughed. This ain't Karl Marx. I saw a photograph of him once. Mrs. Hackett was staring at him.
You did?
Sure. He flushed a little. What's the matter with that?
I'd sure like to know more about him, Mrs. Hackett said. I think we ought to know more, for our own good.
Hey, mister, want a ride? Conga turned quickly, dropping his hand to his belt. He relaxed. 2 young kids in a car, a girl and a boy. He smiled at them. A ride? Sure. Conga got into the car and closed the door. Bill Willett pushed the gas and the car roared down the highway. I appreciate a ride, Conga said carefully. I was taking a walk between towns, but it was farther than I thought.
Where are you from?
Laura Hunt asked. She was pretty, small and dark in her yellow sweater and blue skirt. From Cooper Creek. Cooper Creek? Bill said. He frowned. That's funny, I don't remember seeing you before. Why, do you come from there? I was born there. I know everybody there. I just moved in. From Oregon. From Oregon? I didn't know Oregon people had accents. Do I have an accent? You use words funny. How? I don't know. Doesn't he, Laura? You slur them, Laura said, smiling. Talk some more. I'm interested in dialects. She glanced at him, white teeth. Conga felt his heart constrict. I have a speech impediment. Oh, her eyes widened. I'm sorry. They looked at him curiously as the car purred along. Conga, for his part, was struggling to find some way of asking them questions without seeming curious. I guess people from out of town don't come here much, he said. Strangers. No, Bill shook his head. Not very much. I'll bet I'm the first outsider for a long time. I guess so. Conga hesitated. A friend of mine, someone I know, might be coming through here. Where do you suppose I might... He stopped. Would there be anyone certain to see him? Someone I could ask, make sure I don't miss him if he comes? They were puzzled. Just keep your eyes open. Cooper Creek isn't very big. No, that's right. They drove in silence. Conga studied the outline of the girl. Probably she was the boy's mistress. Perhaps she was his trial wife. Or had they developed trial marriage back so far? He could not remember. But surely such an attractive girl would be someone's mistress by this time. She would be 16 or so by her looks. He might ask her sometime if they ever met again. The next day Conga went walking along the one main street of Cooper Creek. He passed the general store, the 2 filling stations, and then the post office. At the corner was the soda fountain. He stopped. Laura was sitting inside talking to the clerk. She was laughing, rocking back and forth. Conga pushed the door open. Warm air rushed around him. Laura was drinking hot chocolate with whipped cream. She looked up in surprise as he slid into the seat beside her. I beg your pardon, he said. Am I intruding? No, she shook her head. Her eyes were large and dark. Not at all. The clerk came over. What do you want? Conga looked at the chocolate. Same as she has. Laura was watching Conga, her arms folded, elbows on the counter. She smiled at him. By the way, you don't know my name. Laura Hunt. She was holding out her hand. He took it awkwardly, not knowing what to do with it. Conga is my name, he murmured. Conga? Is that your last or first name? Last or first? He hesitated. Last. Omar Conga. Omar? She laughed. That's like the poet, Omar Khayyam. I don't know of him. I know very little of poets. We restored very few works of art. Usually only the church has been interested enough. He broke off. She was staring. He flushed. Where I come from, he finished. The church? Which church do you mean? The church. He was confused. The chocolate came and he began to sip it gratefully. Laura was still watching him. You're an unusual person, she said. Bill didn't like you, but he never likes anything different. He's so prosaic. Don't you think that when a person gets older he should become broadened in his outlook? Conga nodded. He says foreign people ought to stay where they belong, not come here.
But you're not so foreign. He means Orientals, you know.
Conga nodded. The screen door opened behind them. Bill came into the room. He stared at them. "Well," he said. Conga turned. "Hello." "Well," Bill sat down. "Hello, Laura." He was looking at Conga. "I didn't expect to see you here." Conga tensed. He could feel the hostility of the boy. "Something wrong with that?" "No, nothing wrong with it." There was silence. Suddenly Bill turned to Laura. "Come on, let's go."
"Go?" She was astonished. "Why?"
"Just go." He grabbed her hand. "Come on, the car's outside."
"Why, Bill Willett," Laura said. "You're jealous."
"Who is this guy?" Bill said. "Do you know anything about him? Look at him, his beard." She flared.
"So what? Just because he doesn't drive a Packard and go to Cooper High?"
Conga sized the boy up. He was big and strong. Probably he was part of some civil control organization. "Sorry," Conga said. "I'll go." "What's your business in town?" Bill asked. "What are you doing here? Why are you hanging around Laura?" Conga looked at the girl. He shrugged. "No reason. I'll see you later." He turned away and froze. Bill had moved. Conga's fingers went to his belt. "Half pressure," he whispered to himself. "No more. Half pressure." He squeezed. The room leaped around him. He himself was protected by the lining of his clothing, the plastic sheathing inside. "My God!" Laura put her hands up. Conga cursed. He hadn't meant any of it for her, but it would wear off. There was only a half amp to it. It would tingle. Tingle and paralyze. He walked out the door without looking back. He was almost to the corner when Bill came slowly out, holding onto the wall like a drunken man. Conga went on. As Conga walked, restless in the night, a form loomed in front of him. He stopped, holding his breath. "Who is it?" a man's voice came. Conga waited, tense. "Who is it?" the man said again. He clicked something in his hand. A light flashed. Conga moved. "It's me," he said. "Who is me?" "Conga is my name. I'm staying at the Appletons' place. Who are you?" The man came slowly up to him. He was wearing a leather jacket. There was a gun at his waist. "I'm Sheriff Duff. I think you're the person I want to talk to. You were in Bloom's today about 3 o'clock. "Bloom's?" "The fountain, where the kids hang out." Duff came up beside him, shining his light into Conga's face. Conga blinked. "Turn that thing away," he said. A pause. "All right." The light flickered to the ground. "You were there. Some trouble broke out between you and the Willett boy. Is that right? You had a beef over his girl." "We had a discussion," Conga said carefully. "Then what happened?" "Why?" "I'm just curious. They say you did something." "Did something? Did what?" "I don't know. That's what I'm wondering. They saw a flash and something seemed to happen. They all blacked out, couldn't move." "How are they now?" "All right." There was silence. "Well," Duff said, "what was it? A bomb?" "A bomb?" Conga laughed. "No. My cigarette lighter caught fire. There was a leak and the fluid ignited." "Why did they all pass out?" "Fumes." Silence. Conga shifted, waiting. His fingers moved slowly toward his belt. The sheriff glanced down. He grunted. "If you say so," he said. "Anyhow, there wasn't any real harm done." He stepped back from Conga. "And that Willett is a troublemaker." "Good night, then," Conga said. He started past the sheriff. "One more thing, Mr. Conga, before you go. You don't mind if I look at your identification, do you?" "No, not at all." Conga reached into his pocket. He held his wallet out. The sheriff took it and shined his flashlight on it. Conga watched, breathing shallowly. They had worked hard on the wallet, studying historic documents, relics of the times, all the papers they felt would be relevant. Duff handed it back. "Okay, sorry to bother you." The light winked off. When Conga reached the house, he found the Appletons sitting around the television set. They did not look up as he came in. He lingered at the door. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Mrs. Appleton turned slowly. "Can I ask you, what's the date?"
"The date?" She studied him. "The 1st of December."
"December 1st? Why, it was just November." They were all looking at him. Suddenly he remembered. In the 20th century they still used the old 12-month system. November fed directly into December. There was no quartember between. He gasped. Then it was tomorrow. The 2nd of December. Tomorrow. Thanks, he said. Thanks. He went up the stairs. What a fool he was forgetting. The founder had been taken into captivity on the 2nd of December, according to the newspaper records. Tomorrow, only 12 hours hence, the founder would appear to speak to the people and then be dragged away. The day was warm and bright. Conga's shoes crunched the melting crust of snow. On he went, through the trees heavy with white. He climbed a hill and strode down the other side, sliding as he went. He stopped to look around. Everything was silent. There was no one in sight. He brought a thin rod from his waist and turned the handle of it. For a moment nothing happened. Then there was a shimmering in the air. The crystal cage appeared and settled slowly down. Conga sighed. It was good to see it again. After all, it was his only way back. He walked up on the ridge. He looked around with some satisfaction, his hands on his hips. Hudson's Field was spread out all the way to the beginning of town. It was bare and flat, covered with a thin layer of snow. Here the founder would come. Here he would speak to them. And here the authorities would take him. Only he would be dead before they came. He would be dead before he even spoke. Conga returned to the crystal globe. He pushed through the door and stepped inside. He took the Slem gun from the shelf and screwed the bolt into place. It was ready to go, ready to fire. For a moment he considered. Should he have it with him? No. It might be hours before the founder came, and suppose someone approached him in the meantime. When he saw the founder coming toward the field, then he could go and get the gun. Conga looked toward the shelf. There was the neat plastic package. He took it down and unwrapped it. He held the skull in his hands, turning it over. In spite of himself, a cold feeling rushed through him. This was the man's skull, the skull of the founder who was still alive, who would come here this day, who would stand on the field not 50 yards away. What if he could see this, his own skull, yellow and eroded? 2 centuries old. Would he still speak? Would he speak if he could see it, the grinning, aged skull? What would there be for him to say, to tell the people? What message could he bring? What action would not be futile when a man could look upon his own aged yellow skull? Better they should enjoy their temporary lives while they still had them to enjoy. A man who could hold his own skull in his hands would believe in few causes, few movements. Rather, he would preach the opposite. A sound. Conga dropped the skull back on the shelf and took up the gun. Outside something was moving. He went quickly to the door, his heart beating. Was it he? Was it the founder wandering by himself in the cold, looking for a place to speak? Was he meditating over his words, choosing his sentences? What if he could see what Conga had held? He pushed the door open, the gun raised. Laura! He stared at her. She was dressed in a wool jacket and boots, her hands in her pockets. A cloud of steam came from her mouth and nostrils. Her breast was rising and falling. Silently they looked at each other. At last Conga lowered the gun. "What is it?" he said. "What are you doing here?" She pointed. She did not seem able to speak. He frowned. What was wrong with her? "What is it?" he said. "What do you want?" He looked in the direction she had pointed. "I don't see anything." "They're coming." "They? Who? Who are coming?" "They are. The police. During the night the sheriff had the state police send cars. All around, everywhere. Blocking the roads. There's about 60 of them coming. Some from town, some around behind." She stopped, gasping. They said... "What?" "They said you were some kind of a communist. They said..." Conga went into the cage. He put the gun down on the shelf and came back out. He leaped down and went to the girl. "Thanks. You came here to tell me? You don't believe it?" "I don't know." "Did you come alone?"
"No, Joe brought me in his truck, from town."
"Joe? Who's he?"
"Joe French, the plumber. He's a friend of Dad's."
"Let's go." They crossed the snow, up the ridge and onto the field. The little panel truck was parked halfway across the field. A heavy, short man was sitting behind the wheel smoking his pipe. He sat up as he saw the two of them coming toward him. "Are you the one?" he said to Conga. "Yes. Thanks for warning me." The plumber shrugged. "I don't know anything about this. Laura says you're all right." He turned around. "It might interest you to know some more of them are coming. Not to warn you, just curious." "More of them?" Conga looked toward the town. Black shapes were picking their way across the snow.
People from the town. You can't keep this sort of thing quiet, not in a small town. We all listen to the police radio. They heard the same way Laura did. Someone tuned in, spread it around.
The shapes were getting closer. Conga could make out a couple of them. Bill Willett was there with some boys from the high school. The Appletons were along, hanging back in the rear. Even Ed Davies, Conga murmured. The storekeeper was toiling onto the field with 3 or 4 other men from the town.
All curious as hell, French said. Well, I guess I'm going back to town. I don't want my truck shop full of holes. Come on, Laura.
She was looking up at Conga wide-eyed.
Come on, French said again. Let's go. You sure as hell can't stay here, you know.
Why?
There may be shooting. That's what they all came to see. You know that, don't you, Conga?
Yes.
You have a gun, or don't you care?
French smiled a little.
They've picked up a lot of people in that time, you know. You won't be lonely.
He cared, all right. He had to stay here on the field. He couldn't afford to let them take him away. Any minute the founder would appear, would step onto the field. Would he be one of the townsmen standing silently at the foot of the field, waiting, watching? Or maybe he was Joe French, or maybe one of the cops. Any one of them might find himself moved to speak, and the few words spoken this day were going to be important for a long time. And Conga had to be there, ready when the first word was uttered. I care, he said. You go on back to town. Take the girl with you. Laura got stiffly in beside Joe French. The plumber started up the motor. Look at them.
Look at them, standing there, he said. Like vultures, waiting to see someone get killed.
The truck drove away, Laura sitting stiff and silent, frightened now. Conga watched for a moment, then he dashed back into the woods between the trees toward the ridge. He could get away, of course. Any time he wanted to, he could get away. All he had to do was leap into the crystal cage and turn the handles. But he had a job, an important job. He had to be here at this place, at this time. He reached the cage and opened the door. He went inside and picked up the gun from the shelf. The Slem gun would take care of them. He notched it up to full count. The chain reaction from it would flatten them all, the police, the curious, sadistic people. They wouldn't take him. Before they got him, all of them would be dead. He would get away. He would escape. By the end of the day, they would all be dead if that was what they wanted, and he saw the skull. Suddenly, he put the gun down. He picked up the skull. He turned the skull over. He looked at the teeth. Then he went to the mirror. He held the skull up, looking in the mirror. He pressed the skull against his cheek. Beside his own face, the grinning skull leered back at him. Beside his skull, against his living flesh. He bared his teeth, and he knew. It was his own skull that he held. He was the one who would die. He was the founder. After a time, he put the skull down. For a few minutes, he stood at the controls, playing with them idly. He could hear the sound of motors outside, the muffled noise of men. Should he go back to the present, where the speaker waited? He could escape, of course. Escape? He turned toward the skull. There it was, his skull, yellow with age. Escape? Escape when he had held it in his own hands? What did it matter if he put it off a month, a year, 10 years, even 50? Time was nothing. He had sipped chocolate with a girl born 150 years before his time. Escape? For a little while, perhaps. But he could not really escape, no more so than anyone else had ever escaped or ever would. Only he had held it in his hands, his own bones, his own death's head. They had not. He went out the door and across the field empty-handed. There were a lot of them standing around, gathered together, waiting. They expected a good fight. They knew he had something. They had heard about the incident at the fountain. And there were plenty of police with guns and tear gas, creeping across the hills and ridges between the trees, closer and closer. It was an old story in this century. One of the men tossed something at him. It fell in the snow by his feet, and he looked down. It was a rock. He smiled.
"Come on," one of them called. "Don't you have any bombs?" "Throw a bomb. You with the beard. Throw a bomb." "Let 'em have it." "Toss a few A-bombs."
They began to laugh. He smiled. He put his hands to his hips. They suddenly turned silent, seeing that he was going to speak. "I'm sorry," he said simply. I don't have any bombs. You're mistaken. There was a flurry of murmuring. I have a gun, he went on. A very good one. Made by science even more advanced than your own. But I'm not going to use that either. They were puzzled.
Why not?
Someone called. At the edge of the group an older woman was watching. He felt a sudden shock. He had seen her before. Where? He remembered. The day at the library. As he had turned the corner he had seen her. She had noticed him and been astounded. At the time he did not understand why. Conga grinned. So he would escape death, the man who right now was voluntarily accepting it. They were laughing at a man who had a gun but didn't use it. But by a strange twist of science he would appear again a few months later, after his bones had been buried under the floor of a jail. And so, in a fashion, he would escape death. He would die, but then, after a period of months, he would live again, briefly, for an afternoon. An afternoon. Yet long enough for them to see him, to understand that he was still alive, to know that somehow he had returned to life. And then, finally, he would appear once more, after 200 years had passed, 2 centuries later. He would be born again, born, as a matter of fact, in a small trading village on Mars. He would grow up learning to hunt and trade. A police car came on the edge of the field and stopped. The people retreated a little. Conga raised his hands. I have an odd paradox for you, he said. Those who take lives will lose their own. Those who kill will die. But he who gives his own life away will live again. They laughed faintly, nervously. The police were coming out, walking toward him. He smiled. He had said everything he intended to say. It was a good little paradox he had coined. They would puzzle over it, remember it. Smiling, Conga awaited a death foreordained.
If you're enjoying the video, please hit the like button to support the channel. Thanks.
Beyond Lies the Wub by Philip K. Dick. Narrated by William Skye. The slovenly wub might well have said, Many men talk like philosophers and live like fools. They had almost finished with the loading. Outside stood the Optus, his arms folded, his face sunk in gloom. Captain Franco walked leisurely down the gangplank, grinning.
What's the matter? He said. You getting paid for all this?
The Optus said nothing. He turned away, collecting his robes. The captain put his boot on the hem of the robe.
Just a minute, don't go off. I'm not finished.
Oh? The Optus turned with dignity. I'm going back to the village. He looked toward the animals and birds being driven up the gangplank into the spaceship. I must organize new hunts. Franco lit a cigarette.
Why not? You people can go out into the veldt and track it all down again. But when we run out halfway between Mars and Earth...
The Optus went off wordless. Franco joined the first mate at the bottom of the gangplank.
How's it coming? He said. He looked at his watch. We got a good bargain here.
The mate glanced at him sourly.
How do you explain that? What's the matter with you? We need it more than they do. I'll see you later, Captain.
The mate threaded his way up the plank between the long-legged Martian go-birds into the ship. Franco watched him disappear. He was just starting up after him, up the plank toward the port, when he saw it.
My God!
He stood staring, his hands on his hips. Peterson was walking along the path, his face red, leading it by a string.
I'm sorry, Captain,
he said, tugging at the string. Franco walked toward him.
What is it?
The wub stood, sagging, its great body settling slowly. It was sitting down, its eyes half shut. A few flies buzzed about its flank, and it switched its tail. It sat. There was silence.
It's a wub, Peterson said. I got it from a native for 50 cents. He said it was a very unusual animal, very respected. This?
Franco poked the great sloping side of the wub.
It's a pig! A huge dirty pig!
Yes, sir, it's a pig. The natives call it a wub.
A huge pig! It must weigh 400 pounds.
Franco grabbed a tuft of the rough hair. The wub gasped. Its eyes opened, small and moist. Then its great mouth twitched. A tear rolled down the wub's cheek and splashed on the floor. Maybe it's good to eat, Peterson said nervously.
We'll soon find out, Franco said.
The Wub survived the takeoff, sound asleep in the hold of the ship. When they were out in space and everything was running smoothly, Captain Franco bade his men fetch the Wub upstairs so that he might perceive what manner of beast it was. The Wub grunted and wheezed, squeezing up the passageway.
Come on, Jones
grated, pulling at the rope. The Wub twisted, rubbing its skin off on the smooth chrome walls. It burst into the anteroom, tumbling down in a heap. The men leaped up.
Good Lord, French said. What is it?
Peterson says it's a wub, Jones said. It belongs to him.
He kicked at the Wub. The Wub stood up unsteadily, panting.
What's the matter with it? French came over. Is it going to be sick?
They watched. The Wub rolled its eyes mournfully. It gazed around at the men. I think it's thirsty, Peterson said. He went to get some water. French shook his head.
No wonder we had so much trouble taking off. I had to reset all my ballast calculations.
Peterson came back with the water. The Wub began to lap gratefully, splashing the men. Captain Franco appeared at the door.
Let's have a look at it.
He advanced, squinting critically.
You got this for 50 cents?
Yes, sir, Peterson said. It eats almost anything. I fed it on grain and it liked that, and then potatoes and mash and scraps from the table and milk. It seems to enjoy eating. After it eats, it lies down and goes to sleep.
I see, Captain Franco said. Now, as to its taste, that's the real question. I doubt if there's much point in fattening it up anymore. It seems fat enough to me already. Where's the cook? I want him here. I want to find out...
The Wub stopped lapping and looked up at the captain.
Really, Captain, the Wub said. I suggest we talk of other matters.
The room was silent.
What was that? Franco said. Just now.
The Wub, sir, Peterson said. It spoke. They all looked at the Wub.
What did it say? What did it say?
It suggested we talk about other things. Franco walked toward the Wub. He went all around it, examining it from every side. Then he came back over and stood with the men.
I wonder if there's a native inside it, he said thoughtfully. Maybe we should open it up and have a look.
Oh, goodness, the Wub cried. Is that all you people can think of, killing and cutting? Franco clenched his fists.
Come out of there! Whoever you are, come out!
Nothing stirred. The men stood together, their faces blank, staring at the Wub. The Wub swished its tail. It belched suddenly.
I beg your pardon,
the Wub said.
I don't think there's anyone in there,
Jones said in a low voice. They all looked at each other. The cook came in.
You wanted me, Captain? He said. What's this thing? This is a wub, Franco said. It's to be eaten. Will you measure it and figure out...
I think we should have a talk, the Wub said. I'd like to discuss this with you, Captain, if I might. I can see that you and I do not agree on some basic issues. The captain took a long time to answer. The Wub waited good-naturedly, licking the water from its jowls.
Come into my office, the captain said at last.
He turned and walked out of the room. The Wub rose and padded after him. The men watched it go out. They heard it climbing the stairs.
I wonder what the outcome will be, the cook said. Well, I'll be in the kitchen. Let me know as soon as you hear.
Sure, Jones said. Sure. The Wub eased itself down in the corner with a sigh. You must forgive me, it said. I'm afraid I'm addicted to various forms of relaxation. When one is as large as I... The captain nodded impatiently. He sat down at his desk and folded his hands.
All right, he said. Let's get started. You're a wub, is that correct?
The Wub shrugged. I suppose so. That's what they call us, the natives, I mean. We have our own term.
And you speak English? You've been in contact with Earthmen before?
No.
Then how do you do it?
Speak English? Am I speaking English? I'm not conscious of speaking anything in particular. I examined your mind.
My mind?
I studied the contents, especially the semantic warehouse, as I refer to it.
I see, the captain said. Telepathy, of course.
We are a very old race, the Wub said. Very old and very ponderous. It is difficult for us to move around. You can appreciate that anything so slow and heavy would be at the mercy of more agile forms of life. There was no use in our relying on physical defences. How could we win? Too heavy to run, too soft to fight, too good-natured to hunt for game.
How do you live?
Plants, vegetables. We can eat almost anything. We're very Catholic. Tolerant, eclectic, Catholic. We live and let live. That's how we've gotten along." The wub eyed the captain.
"And that's why I so violently objected to this business about having me boiled. I could see the image in your mind. Most of me in the frozen food locker, some of me in the kettle, a bit for your pet cat." "So you read minds," the captain said. "How interesting. Anything else? I mean, what else can you do along those lines?"
"A few odds and ends," the wub said absently, staring around the room. "A nice apartment you have here, Captain. You keep it quite neat. I respect life forms that are tidy. Some Martian birds are quite tidy. They throw things out of their nests and sweep them."
"Indeed," the captain nodded. "But to get back to the problem."
"Quite so. You spoke of dining on me. The taste, I am told, is good. A little fatty, but tender. But how can any lasting contact be established between your people and mine if you resort to such barbaric attitudes?"
"Eat me? Rather you should discuss questions with me, philosophy, the arts." The captain stood up. "Philosophy? It might interest you to know that we will be hard put to find something to eat for the next month. An unfortunate spoilage."
"I know," the wub nodded. "But wouldn't it be more in accord with your principles of democracy if we all drew straws or something along that line? After all, democracy is to protect the minority from just such infringements. Now, if each of us casts one vote—" The captain walked to the door.
"Nuts to you," he said.
He opened the door. He opened his mouth. He stood frozen, his mouth wide, his eyes staring, his fingers still on the knob. The wub watched him. Presently it padded out of the room, edging past the captain. It went down the hall, deep in meditation. The room was quiet. "So you see," the wub said, "we have a common myth. Your mind contains many familiar myth symbols. Ishtar, Odysseus." Peterson sat silently staring at the floor. He shifted in his chair. "Go on," he said. "Please go on." "I find in your Odysseus a figure common to the mythology of most self-conscious races. As I interpret it, Odysseus wanders as an individual, aware of himself as such. This is the idea of separation from family and country, the process of individuation." "But Odysseus returns to his home." Peterson looked out the port window at the stars, endless stars burning intently in the empty universe. "Finally he goes home." "As must all creatures. The moment of separation is a temporary period, a brief journey of the soul. It begins, it ends. The wanderer returns to land and race." The door opened. The wub stopped, turning its great head. Captain Franco came into the room, the men behind him. They hesitated at the door.
"Are you all right?" French said.
"Do you mean me?" Peterson said, surprised. "Why me?" Franco lowered his gun.
"Come over here," he said to Peterson. "Get up and come here."
There was silence. "Go ahead," the wub said. "It doesn't matter." Peterson stood up.
"What for?" "It's an order."
Peterson walked to the door. French caught his arm.
"What's going on?"
Peterson wrenched loose.
"What's the matter with you?"
Captain Franco moved toward the wub. The wub looked up from where it lay in the corner, pressed against the wall. "It is interesting," the wub said, "that you are obsessed with the idea of eating me. I wonder why."
"Get up,"
Franco said. "If you wish." The wub rose, grunting. "Be patient. It is difficult for me." It stood, gasping, its tongue lolling foolishly.
"Shoot it now,"
French said.
"For God's sake!"
Peterson exclaimed. Jones turned to him quickly, his eyes grey with fear.
"You didn't see him, like a statue standing there, his mouth open. If we hadn't come down, he'd still be there."
"Who? The captain?" Peterson stared around. "But he's all right now." They looked at the wub standing in the middle of the room, its great chest rising and falling.
"Come on," Franco said. "Out of the way."
The men pulled aside toward the door. "You are quite afraid, aren't you?" the wub said. "Have I done anything to you? I am against the idea of hurting. All I have done is try to protect myself. Can you expect me to rush eagerly to my death? I am a sensible being, like yourselves. I was curious to see your ship, learn about you. I suggested to the native—" The gun jerked.
"See?" Franco said. "I thought so."
The wub settled down, panting. It put its paw out, pulling its tail around it. "It is very warm," the wub said. "I understand that we are close to the jets. Atomic power. You have done many wonderful things with it, technically. Apparently your scientific hierarchy is not equipped to solve moral, ethical—" Franco turned to the men crowding behind him, wide-eyed, silent. "I'll do it. You can watch." French nodded. "Try to hit the brain. It's no good for eating. Don't hit the chest. If the ribcage shatters, we'll have to pick bones out." "Listen," Peterson said, licking his lips. "Has it done anything? What harm has it done? I'm asking you. And anyhow, it's still mine. You have no right to shoot it. It doesn't belong to you." Franco raised his gun. "I'm going out," Jones said, his face white and sick. "I don't want to see it." "Me too," French said. The men straggled out, murmuring. Peterson lingered at the door. "It was talking to me about myths," he said. "It wouldn't hurt anyone." He went outside. Franco walked toward the wub. The wub looked up slowly. It swallowed. "A very foolish thing," it said. "I am sorry that you want to do it. There was a parable that your saviour related—" It stopped, staring at the gun. "Can you look me in the eye and do it?" the wub said. "Can you do that?" The captain gazed down. "I can look you in the eye," he said. "Back on the farm we had hogs, dirty razorback hogs. I can do it." Staring down at the wub, into the gleaming, moist eyes, he pressed the trigger. The taste was excellent. They sat glumly around the table, some of them hardly eating at all. The only one who seemed to be enjoying himself was Captain Franco. "More?" he said, looking around. "More? And some wine, perhaps?" "Not me," French said. "I think I'll go back to the chart room." "Me too," Jones stood up, pushing his chair back. "I'll see you later." The captain watched them go. Some of the others excused themselves. "What do you suppose the matter is?" the captain said. He turned to Peterson. Peterson sat staring down at his plate, at the potatoes, the green peas, and at the thick slab of tender, warm meat. He opened his mouth. No sound came. The captain put his hand on Peterson's shoulder. "It is only organic matter now," he said. "The life essence is gone." He ate, spooning up the gravy with some bread. "I, myself, love to eat. It is one of the greatest things that a living creature can enjoy. Eating, resting, meditation, discussing things." Peterson nodded. 2 more men got up and went out. The captain drank some water and sighed. "Well," he said, "I must say that this was a very enjoyable meal. All the reports I had heard were quite true, the taste of wub. Very fine. But I was prevented from enjoying this pleasure in times past." He dabbed at his lips with his napkin and leaned back in his chair. Peterson stared dejectedly at the table. The captain watched him intently. He leaned over. "Come, come," he said. "Cheer up. Let's discuss things." He smiled. "As I was saying before I was interrupted, the role of Odysseus in the myths—" Peterson jerked up, staring. "To go on," the captain said, "Odysseus, as I understand him—"
The Eyes Have It by Philip K. Dick. Narrated by William Skye. It was quite by accident I discovered this incredible invasion of Earth by life forms from another planet. As yet, I haven't done anything about it. I can't think of anything to do. I wrote to the government, and they sent back a pamphlet on the repair and maintenance of frame houses. Anyhow, the whole thing is known. I'm not the first to discover it. Maybe it's even under control. I was sitting in my easy chair, idly turning the pages of a paperbacked book someone had left on the bus when I came across the reference that first put me on the trail. For a moment, I didn't respond. It took some time for the full import to sink in. After I'd comprehended, it seemed odd I hadn't noticed it right away. The reference was clearly to a non-human species of incredible properties, not indigenous to Earth. A species, I hasten to point out, customarily masquerading as ordinary human beings. Their disguise, however, became transparent in the face of the following observations by the author. It was at once obvious the author knew everything. Knew everything and was taking it in his stride. The line, and I tremble remembering it even now, read, His eyes slowly roved about the room. Vague chills assailed me. I tried to picture the eyes. Did they roll like dimes? The passage indicated not. They seemed to move through the air, not over the surface. Rather rapidly, apparently. No one in the story was surprised. That's what tipped me off. No sign of amazement at such an outrageous thing. Later, the matter was amplified. His eyes moved from person to person. There it was, in a nutshell. The eyes had clearly come apart from the rest of him and were on their own. My heart pounded and my breath choked in my windpipe. I had stumbled on an accidental mention of a totally unfamiliar race, obviously non-terrestrial, yet to the characters in the book it was perfectly natural, which suggested they belonged to the same species. And the author? A slow suspicion burned in my mind. The author was taking it rather too easily in his stride. Evidently he felt this was quite a usual thing. He made absolutely no attempt to conceal this knowledge. The story continued. Presently his eyes fastened on Julia. Julia, being a lady, had at least the breeding to feel indignant. She is described as blushing and knitting her brows angrily. At this I sighed with relief. They weren't all non-terrestrials. The narrative continues. Slowly, calmly, his eyes examined every inch of her. Great Scott! But here the girl turned and stomped off and the matter ended. I lay back in my chair gasping with horror. My wife and family regarded me in wonder. "What's wrong, dear?" my wife asked. I couldn't tell her. Knowledge like this was too much for the ordinary run-of-the-mill person. I had to keep it to myself. "Nothing," I gasped. I leaped up, snatched the book, and hurried out of the room. In the garage, I continued reading. There was more. Trembling, I read the next revealing passage. He put his arm around Julia. Presently, she asked him if he would remove his arm. He immediately did so, with a smile. It's not said what was done with the arm after the fellow had removed it. Maybe it was left standing upright in the corner. Maybe it was thrown away. I don't care. In any case, the full meaning was there, staring me right in the face. Here was a race of creatures capable of removing portions of their anatomy at will. Eyes, arms, and maybe more. Without batting an eyelash. My knowledge of biology came in handy at this point. Obviously they were simple beings, unicellular, some sort of primitive single-celled things. Beings no more developed than starfish. Starfish can do the same thing, you know. I read on, and came to this incredible revelation, tossed off coolly by the author without the faintest tremor. Outside the movie theatre, we split up. Part of us went inside, part over to the cafe for dinner. Binary fission, obviously, splitting in half and forming two entities. Probably each lower half went to the cafe, it being farther, and the upper halves to the movies. I read on, hands shaking. I had really stumbled onto something here. My mind reeled as I made out this passage. "I'm afraid there's no doubt about it. Poor Bibney has lost his head again." Which was followed by, "And Bob says he has utterly no guts." Yet Bibney got around as well as the next person. The next person, however, was just as strange. He was soon described as totally lacking in brains. There was no doubt of the thing in the next passage. Julia, whom I had thought to be the one normal person, reveals herself as also being an alien life form, similar to the rest. Quite deliberately, Julia had given her heart to the young man. It didn't relate what the final disposition of the organ was, but I didn't really care. It was evident Julia had gone right on living in her usual manner, like all the others in the book. Without heart, arms, eyes, brains, viscera, dividing up in two when the occasion demanded. Without a qualm. Thereupon she gave him her hand. I sickened. The rascal now had her hand as well as her heart. I shudder to think what he's done with them by this time. He took her arm. Not content to wait, he had to start dismantling her on his own. Flushing crimson, I slammed the book shut and leaped to my feet. but not in time to escape one last reference to those carefree bits of anatomy whose travels had originally thrown me on the track. Her eyes followed him all the way down the road and across the meadow. I rushed from the garage and back inside the warm house, as if the accursed things were following me. My wife and children were playing Monopoly in the kitchen. I joined them and played with frantic fervour, brow feverish, teeth chattering. I had had enough of the thing. I want to hear no more about it. Let them come on. Let them invade Earth. I don't want to get mixed up in it. I have absolutely no stomach for it. Remember to hit the like button to help this video spread. Thanks. Piper in the Woods by Philip K. Dick. Narrated by William Skye. Earth maintained an important garrison on asteroid Y3. Now suddenly it was imperiled with a biological impossibility. Men becoming plants. Well, Corporal Westerberg, Dr. Henry Harris said gently, just why do you think you're a plant? As he spoke, Harris glanced down again at the card on his desk. It was from the base commander himself, made out in Cox's heavy scrawl. Doc, this is the lad I told you about. Talk to him and try to find out how he got this delusion. He's from the new garrison, the new check station on asteroid Y3, and we don't want anything to go wrong there. Especially a silly damn thing like this. Harris pushed the card aside and stared back up at the youth across the desk from him. The young man seemed ill at ease and appeared to be avoiding answering the question Harris had put to him. Harris frowned. Westerberg was a good-looking chap, actually handsome in his patrol uniform, a shock of blonde hair over one eye. He was tall, almost 6 feet, a fine, healthy lad, just 2 years out of training according to the card. Born in Detroit, had measles when he was 9, interested in jet engines, tennis and girls, 26 years old. Well, Corporal Westerberg, Dr. Harris said again, why do you think you're a plant? The corporal looked up shyly. He cleared his throat. Sir, I am a plant. I don't just think so. I've been a plant for several days now. I see, the doctor nodded. You mean that you weren't always a plant? No, sir, I just became a plant recently. And what were you before you became a plant? Well, sir, I was just like the rest of you. There was silence. Dr. Harris took up his pen and scratched a few lines, but nothing of importance came. A plant? And such a healthy-looking lad. Harris removed his steel-rimmed glasses and polished them with his handkerchief. He put them on again and leaned back in his chair. Care for a cigarette, Corporal? No, sir. The doctor lit one himself, resting his arm on the edge of the chair. Corporal, you must realize that there are very few men who become plants, especially on such short notice. I have to admit you are the first person who has ever told me such a thing. Yes, sir, I realize it's quite rare. You can understand why I'm interested, then. When you say you're a plant, you mean you're not capable of mobility? Or do you mean you're a vegetable, as opposed to an animal? Or just what? The corporal looked away. I can't tell you any more, he murmured. I'm sorry, sir. Well, would you mind telling me how you became a plant? Corporal Westerberg hesitated. He stared down at the floor, then out the window at the spaceport, then at a fly on the desk. At last he stood up, getting slowly to his feet. I can't even tell you that, sir, he said. You can't? Why not? Because I promised not to. The room was silent. Dr. Harris rose too, and they both stood facing each other. Harris frowned, rubbing his jaw. Corporal, just who did you promise? I can't even tell you that, sir. I'm sorry. The doctor considered this. At last he went to the door and opened it. All right, Corporal, you may go now. And thanks for your time. I'm sorry I'm not more helpful. The corporal went slowly out and Harris closed the door after him. Then he went across his office to the vidphone. He rang Commander Cox's letter. A moment later, the beefy, good-natured face of the base commander appeared. Cox, this is Harris. I talked to him, all right. All I could get is the statement that he's a plant. What else is there? What kind of behaviour pattern? Well, Cox said, the first thing they noticed was that he wouldn't do any work. The garrison chief reported that this Westerberg would wander off outside the garrison and just sit all day long. Just sit. In the sun? Yes, just sit in the sun. Then at nightfall he would come back in. When they asked why he wasn't working in the jet repair building, he told them he had to be out in the sun. Then he said, Cox hesitated. Yes, said what? He said that work was unnatural, that it was a waste of time, that the only worthwhile thing was to sit and contemplate, outside. What then? Then they asked him how he got that idea, and then he revealed to them that he had become a plant. I'm going to have to talk to him again, I can see, Harris said. And he's applied for a permanent discharge from the patrol. What reason did he give? The same, that he's a plant now, and has no more interest in being a patrolman. All he wants to do is sit in the sun. It's the damnedest thing I ever heard. All right, I think I'll visit him in his quarters. Harris looked at his watch. I'll go over after dinner. Good luck, Cox said gloomily. But who ever heard of a man turning into a plant? We told him it wasn't possible, but he just smiled at us. I'll let you know how I make out, Harris said. Harris walked slowly down the hall. It was after 6, the evening meal was over. A dim concept was coming into his mind, but it was much too soon to be sure. He increased his pace, turning right at the end of the hall. 2 nurses passed, hurrying by. Westerberg was quartered with a buddy, a man who had been injured in a jet blast and who was now almost recovered. Harris came to the dorm wing and stopped, checking the numbers on the doors. Can I help you, sir? The robot attendant said, gliding up. I'm looking for Corporal Westerberg's room. 3 doors to the right. Harris went on. Asteroid Y3 had only recently been garrisoned and staffed. It had become the primary checkpoint to halt and examine ships entering the system from outer space. The garrison made sure that no dangerous bacteria, fungus, or whatnot arrived to infect the system. A nice asteroid it was, warm, well-watered, with trees and lakes and lots of sunlight. And the most modern garrison in the 9 planets. He shook his head, coming to the 3rd door. He stopped, raising his hand and knocking. Who's there? Sounded through the door. I want to see Corporal Westerberg. The door opened. A bovine youth with horn-rimmed glasses looked out, a book in his hands. Who are you? Dr. Harris. I'm sorry, sir. Corporal Westerberg is asleep. Would he mind if I woke him up? I want very much to talk to him. Harris peered inside. He could see a neat room with a desk, a rug and lamp, and 2 bunks. On one of the bunks was Westerberg, lying face up, his arms folded across his chest, his eyes tightly closed. Sir, the bovine youth said, I'm afraid I can't wake him up for you, much as I'd like to. You can't? Why not? Sir, Corporal Westerberg won't wake up, not after the sun sets. He just won't. He can't be wakened. Cataleptic? Really? But in the morning, as soon as the sun comes up, he leaps out of bed and goes outside. Stays the whole day. I see, the doctor said. Well, thanks anyhow. He went back out into the hall and the door shut after him. There's more to this than I realized, he murmured. He went on back the way he had come. It was a warm, sunny day. The sky was almost free of clouds and a gentle wind moved through the cedars along the bank of the stream. There was a path leading from the hospital building down the slope to the stream. At the stream, a small bridge led over to the other side, and a few patients were standing on the bridge, wrapped in their bathrobes, looking aimlessly down at the water. It took Harris several minutes to find Westerberg. The youth was not with the other patients, near or around the bridge. He had gone farther down, past the cedar trees and out onto a strip of bright meadow where poppies and grass grew everywhere. He was sitting on the stream bank on a flat grey stone, leaning back and staring up, his mouth open a little. He did not notice the doctor until Harris was almost beside him. Hello, Harris said softly. Westerberg opened his eyes, looking up. He smiled and got slowly to his feet, a graceful, flowing motion that was rather surprising for a man of his size. Hello, Doctor. What brings you out here? Nothing. Thought I'd get some sun. Here, you can share my rock. Westerberg moved over, and Harris sat down gingerly, being careful not to catch his trousers on the sharp edges of the rock. He lit a cigarette and gazed silently down at the water. Beside him, Westerberg had resumed his strange position, leaning back, resting on his hands, staring up with his eyes shut tight. Nice day, the doctor said. Yes. Do you come here every day? Yes. You like it better out here than inside? I can't stay inside, Westerberg said. You can't? How do you mean, can't? You would die without air, wouldn't you? The corporal said. And you'd die without sunlight? Westerberg nodded. Corporal, may I ask you something? Do you plan to do this the rest of your life, sit out in the sun on a flat rock, nothing else? Westerberg nodded. How about your job? You went to school for years to become a patrolman.
You wanted to enter the patrol very badly. You were given a fine rating and a first-class position. How do you feel giving all that up? You know it won't be easy to get back in again. Do you realize that? I realize it. And you're really going to give it all up? That's right. Harris was silent for a while. At last he put his cigarette out and turned toward the youth. All right, let's say you give up your job and sit in the sun. Well, what happens then? Someone else has to do the job instead of you. Isn't that true? The job has to be done. Your job has to be done. And if you don't do it, someone else has to. I suppose so. Westerberg, suppose everyone felt the way you do. Suppose everyone wanted to sit in the sun all day. What would happen? No one would check ships coming from outer space. Bacteria and toxic crystals would enter the system and cause mass death and suffering. Isn't that right? If everyone felt the way I do, they wouldn't be going into outer space. But they have to. They have to trade, they have to get minerals and products and new plants. Why? To keep society going. Why? Well, Harris gestured, people couldn't live without society. Westerberg said nothing to that. Harris watched him, but the youth did not answer. Isn't that right? Harris said. Perhaps. It's a peculiar business, Doctor. You know, I struggled for years to get through training. I had to work and pay my own way. Washed dishes, worked in kitchens, studied at night, learned, crammed, worked on. And you know what I think now? What? I wish I'd become a plant earlier. Dr. Harris stood up. Westerberg, when you come inside, will you stop off at my office? I want to give you a few tests, if you don't mind. The shock box? Westerberg smiled. I knew that would be coming around. Sure, I don't mind. Nettled, Harris left the rock, walking back up the bank a short distance. About 3, Corporal. The corporal nodded. Harris made his way up the hill to the path toward the hospital building. The whole thing was beginning to become more clear to him. A boy who had struggled all his life, financial insecurity, idealized goal, getting a patrol assignment, finally reached it, found the load too great, and on asteroid Y3 there was too much vegetation to look at all day. Primitive identification and projection on the flora of the asteroid, concept of security involved in immobility and permanence, unchanging forest. He entered the building. A robot orderly stopped him almost at once. Sir, Commander Cox wants you urgently on the vidphone. Thanks. Harris strode to his office. He dialed Cox's letter and the commander's face came presently into focus. Cox, this is Harris. I've been out talking to the boy. I'm beginning to get this lined up now. I can see the pattern. Too much load, too long. Finally gets what he wants and the idealization shatters under the... Harris! Cox barked. Shut up and listen. I just got a report from Y3. They're sending an express rocket here. It's on the way. An express rocket? 5 more cases like Westerberg. All say they're plants. The garrison chief is worried as hell. Says we must find out what it is or the garrison will fall apart right away. Do you get me, Harris? Find out what it is. Yes, sir, Harris murmured. Yes, sir. By the end of the week there were 20 cases, and all, of course, were from asteroid Y3. Commander Cox and Harris stood together at the top of the hill, looking gloomily down at the stream below. 16 men and 4 women sat in the sun along the bank, none of them moving, none speaking. An hour had gone by since Cox and Harris appeared, and in all that time the 20 people below had not stirred. I don't get it, Cox said, shaking his head. I just absolutely don't get it. Harris, is this the beginning of the end? Is everything going to start cracking around us? It gives me a hell of a strange feeling to see those people down there, basking away in the sun, just sitting and basking. Who's that man there with the red hair? That's Ulrich Deutsch. He was second in command at the garrison. Now look at him. Sits and dozes with his mouth open and his eyes shut. A week ago that man was climbing, going right up to the top. When the garrison chief retires, he was supposed to take over. Maybe another year at the most. All his life he's been climbing to get up there. And now he sits in the sun, Harris finished. That woman, the brunette with the short hair, career woman, head of the entire office staff of the garrison. And the man beside her, janitor. And that cute little gal there, with the bosom, secretary, just out of school. All kinds. And I got a note this morning, 3 more coming in sometime today. Harris nodded. The strange thing is, they really want to sit down there. They're completely rational. They could do something else, but they just don't care to. Well, Cox said, what are you going to do? Have you found anything? We're counting on you. Let's hear it. I couldn't get anything out of them directly, Harris said, but I've had some interesting results with the shock box. Let's go inside and I'll show you. Fine. Cox turned and started toward the hospital. Show me anything you've got. This is serious. Now I know how Tiberius felt when Christianity showed up in high places. Harris snapped off the light.
The room was pitch black. "I'll run this first reel for you. The subject is one of the best biologists stationed at the garrison, Robert Bradshaw. He came in yesterday. I got a good run from the shock box because Bradshaw's mind is so highly differentiated. There's a lot of repressed material of non-rational nature, more than usual." He pressed a switch. The projector whirred, and on the far wall a three-dimensional image appeared in colour, so real that it might have been the man himself. Robert Bradshaw was a man of 50, heavy-set, with iron-grey hair and a square jaw. He sat in the chair calmly, his hands resting on the arms, oblivious to the electrodes attached to his neck and wrist. "There I go," Harris said. "Watch." His film image appeared, approaching Bradshaw. "Now, Mr. Bradshaw," his image said, "this won't hurt you at all, and it'll help us a lot." The image rotated the controls on the shock box. Bradshaw stiffened and his jaw set, but otherwise he gave no sign. The image of Harris regarded him for a time, and then stepped away from the controls. "Can you hear me, Mr. Bradshaw?" the image asked. "Yes." "What is your name?" "Robert C. Bradshaw." "What is your position?" "Chief Biologist at the check station on Y3. "Are you there now?" "No, I'm back on Terra, in a hospital." "Why?" "Because I admitted to the garrison chief that I had become a plant." "Is that true, that you are a plant?" "Yes, in a non-biological sense. I retain the physiology of a human being, of course." "What do you mean, then, that you're a plant?" "The reference is to attitudinal response, to Weltanschauung." "Go on." "It is possible for a warm-blooded animal, an upper primate, to adopt the psychology of a plant to some extent." "Yes?" "I refer to this." "And the others, they refer to this also?" "Yes." "How did this occur, your adopting this attitude?" Bradshaw's image hesitated, the lips twisting. "See," Harris said to Cox, "strong conflict. He wouldn't have gone on if he had been fully conscious." "Yes?" "I was taught to become a plant." The image of Harris showed surprise and interest. "What do you mean you were taught to become a plant?" "They realized my problems and taught me to become a plant. Now I'm free from them, the problems." "Who? Who taught you?" "The Pipers." "Who? The Pipers? Who are the Pipers?" There was no answer. "Mr. Bradshaw, who are the Pipers?" After a long, agonized pause, the heavy lips parted. "They live in the woods." Harris snapped off the projector and the lights came on. He and Cox blinked. "That was all I could get," Harris said, "but I was lucky to get that. He wasn't supposed to tell, not at all. That was the thing they all promised not to do, tell who taught them to become plants. The Pipers who live in the woods on asteroid Y3. "You got this story from all 20? "No," Harris grimaced. "Most of them put up too much fight. I couldn't even get this much from them." Cox reflected. "The Pipers? Well, what do you propose to do? Just wait around until you can get the full story? Is that your program?" "No," Harris said. "Not at all. I'm going to Y3 and find out who the Pipers are myself." The small patrol ship made its landing with care and precision, its jets choking into final silence. The hatch slid back and Dr. Henry Harris found himself staring out at a field, a brown, sun-baked landing field. At the end of the field was a tall signal tower. Around the field on all sides were long grey buildings, the garrison check station itself. Not far off, a huge Venusian cruiser was parked, a vast green hulk like an enormous lime. The technicians from the station were swarming all over it, checking and examining each inch of it for lethal lifeforms and poisons that might have attached themselves to the hull. "All out, sir," the pilot said. Harris nodded. He took hold of his 2 suitcases and stepped carefully down. The ground was hot underfoot, and he blinked in the bright sunlight. Jupiter was in the sky, and the vast planet reflected considerable sunlight down onto the asteroid. Harris started across the field, carrying his suitcases. A field attendant was already busy opening the storage compartment of the patrol ship, extracting his trunk. The attendant lowered the trunk into a waiting dolly and came after him, manipulating the little truck with bored skill. As Harris came to the entrance of the signal tower, the gate slid back and a man came forward, an older man, large and robust, with white hair and a steady walk. "How are you, Doctor?" he said, holding his hand out. "I'm Lawrence Watts, the garrison chief." They shook hands. Watts smiled down at Harris. He was a huge old man, still regal and straight in his dark blue uniform, with his gold epaulets sparkling on his shoulders. "Have a good trip?" Watts asked. "Come on inside and I'll have a drink fixed for you. It gets hot around here with the big mirror up there." "Jupiter?" Harris followed him inside the building. The signal tower was cool and dark, a welcome relief. "Why is the gravity so near Terra's? I expected to go flying off like a kangaroo. Is it artificial?"
No, there's a dense core of some kind to the asteroid, some kind of metallic deposit. That's why we picked this asteroid out of all the others. It made the construction problem much simpler, and it also explains why the asteroid has natural air and water. Did you see the hills?
The hills?
When we get up higher in the tower, we'll be able to see over the buildings. There's quite a natural park here, a regular little forest, complete with everything you'd want. Come in here, Harris. This is my office.
The old man strode at quite a clip around the corner and into a large, well-furnished apartment.
Isn't this pleasant? I intend to make my last year as amiable as possible. He frowned. Of course, with Deutsch gone, I may be here forever. Oh well, he shrugged. Sit down, Harris.
Thanks. Harris took a chair, stretching his legs out. He watched Watts as he closed the door to the hall. By the way, any more cases come up?
2 more today. Watts was grim. Makes almost 30 in all. We have 300 men in this station. At the rate it's going.
Chief, you spoke about a forest on the asteroid. Do you allow the crew to go into the forest at will, or do you restrict them to the buildings and grounds?
Watts rubbed his jaw. Well, it's a difficult situation, Harris. I have to let the men leave the grounds sometimes. They can see the forest from the buildings, and as long as you can see a nice place to stretch out and relax, that does it. Once every 10 days, they have a full period of rest. Then they go out and fool around.
And then it happens.
Yes, I suppose so. But as long as they can see the forest, they'll want to go. I can't help it.
I know, I'm not censuring you. Well, what's your theory? What happens to them out there? What do they do?
What happens? Once they get out there and take it easy for a while, they don't want to come back and work. It's boondoggling, playing hooky. They don't want to work, so off they go.
How about this business of their delusions?
Watts laughed good-naturedly. Listen, Harris, you know as well as I do that's a lot of poppycock. They're no more plants than you or I. They just don't want to work, that's all. When I was a cadet, we had a few ways to make people work. I wish we could lay a few on their backs like we used to.
You think this is simple gold bricking, then?
Don't you think it is?
No, Harris said. They really believe they're plants. I put them through the high-frequency shock treatment, the shock box. The whole nervous system is paralyzed, all inhibitions stopped cold. They tell the truth, then, and they said the same thing, and more. Watts paced back and forth, his hands clasped behind his back.
Harris, you're a doctor, and I suppose you know what you're talking about. But look at the situation here. We have a garrison, a good modern garrison. We're probably the most modern outfit in the system. Every new device and gadget is here that science can produce. Harris, this garrison is one vast machine. The men are parts, and each has his job. The maintenance crew, the biologist, the office crew, the managerial staff. Look what happens when one person steps away from his job. Everything else begins to creak. We can't service the bugs if no one services the machines. We can't order food to feed the crews if no one makes out reports, takes inventories. We can't direct any kind of activity if the second-in-command decides to go out and sit in the sun all day. 30 people, 1/10 of the garrison. But we can't run without them. The garrison is built that way. If you take the supports out, the whole building falls. No one can leave. We're all tied here, and these people know it. They know they have no right to do that, run off on their own. No one has that right anymore. We're all too tightly interwoven to suddenly start doing what we want. It's unfair to the rest, the majority.
Harris nodded. Chief, can I ask you something?
What is it?
Are there any inhabitants on the asteroid? Any natives?
Natives? Watts considered. Yes, there's some kind of aborigines living out there.
He waved vaguely toward the window. What are they like? Have you seen them?
Yes, I've seen them. At least I saw them when we first came here. They hung around for a while, watching us, then after a time they disappeared.
Did they die off? Diseases of some kind?
No, they just disappeared into their forest. They're still there someplace.
What kind of people are they?
Well, the story is that they're originally from Mars. They don't look much like Martians, though. They're dark, a kind of coppery colour, thin, very agile in their own way. They hunt and fish. No written language. We don't pay much attention to them.
I see. Harris paused. Chief, have you ever heard of anything called the Pipers?
The Pipers? Watts frowned. No. Why?
The patients mentioned something called the Pipers. According to Bradshaw, the Pipers taught him to become a plant. He learned it from them, a kind of teaching.
The Pipers? What are they?
I don't know, Harris admitted. I thought maybe you might know. My first assumption, of course, was that they're the natives, but now I'm not so sure, not after hearing your description of them.
The natives are primitive savages. They don't have anything to teach anybody, especially a top-flight biologist.
Harris hesitated. Chief, I'd like to go into the woods and look around. Is that possible?
Certainly, I can arrange it for you. I'll give you one of the men to show you around.
I'd rather go alone. Is there any danger?
No, none that I know of, except
the Pipers, Harris finished.
I know. Well, there's only one way to find them, and that's it.
I'll have to take my chances.
If you walk in a straight line, Chief Watts said, you'll find yourself back at the garrison in about 6 hours. It's a damn small asteroid. There's a couple of streams and lakes, so don't fall in.
How about snakes or poisonous insects?
Nothing like that reported. We did a lot of tramping around at first, but it's grown back now the way it was. We never encountered anything dangerous.
Thanks, Chief, Harris said. They shook hands. I'll see you before nightfall.
Good luck.
The chief and his 2 armed escorts turned and went back across the rise down the other side toward the garrison. Harris watched them go until they disappeared inside the building. Then he turned and started into the grove of trees. The woods were very silent around him as he walked. Trees towered up on all sides of him, huge dark green trees like eucalyptus. The ground underfoot was soft with endless leaves that had fallen and rotted into soil. After a while the grove of high trees fell behind and he found himself crossing a dry meadow. The grass and weeds burned brown in the sun. Insects buzzed around him, rising up from the dry weed stalks. Something scuttled ahead, hurrying through the undergrowth. He caught sight of a grey ball with many legs scampering furiously, its antennae weaving. The meadow ended at the bottom of a hill. He was going up now, going higher and higher. Ahead of him an endless expanse of green rose, acres of wild growth. He scrambled to the top finally, blowing and panting, catching his breath. He went on. Now he was going down again, plunging into a deep gully. Tall ferns grew as large as trees. He was entering a living Jurassic forest, ferns that stretched out endlessly ahead of him. Down he went, walking carefully. The air began to turn cold around him. The floor of the gully was damp and silent. Underfoot the ground was almost wet. He came out on a level table. It was dark, with the ferns growing up on all sides, dense growths of ferns, silent and unmoving. He came upon a natural path, an old stream bed, rough and rocky, but easy to follow. The air was thick and oppressive. Beyond the ferns he could see the side of the next hill, a green field rising up. Something grey was ahead. Rocks, piled up boulders, scattered and stacked here and there. The stream bed led directly to them. Apparently this had been a pool of some kind, a stream emptying from it. He climbed the first of the boulders awkwardly, feeling his way up. At the top he paused, resting again. As yet he had had no luck. So far he had not met any of the natives. It would be through them that he would find the mysterious pipers that were stealing the men away, if such really existed. If he could find the natives, talk to them, perhaps he could find out something. But as yet he had been unsuccessful. He looked around. The woods were very silent. A slight breeze moved through the ferns, rustling them, but that was all. Where were the natives? Probably they had a settlement of some sort, huts, a clearing. The asteroid was small. He should be able to find them by nightfall. He started down the rocks. More rocks rose up ahead and he climbed them. Suddenly he stopped, listening. Far off he could hear a sound, the sound of water. Was he approaching a pool of some kind? He went on again, trying to locate the sound. He scrambled down rocks and up rocks, and all around him there was silence, except for the splashing of distant water. Maybe a waterfall, water in motion, a stream. If he found the stream, he might find the natives. The rocks ended and the stream bed began again, but this time it was wet, the bottom muddy and overgrown with moss. He was on the right track. Not too long ago this stream had flowed, probably during the rainy season. He went up on the side of the stream, pushing through the ferns and vines. A golden snake slid expertly out of his path. Something glinted ahead, something sparkling through the ferns. Water. A pool. He hurried, pushing the vines aside and stepping out, leaving them behind. He was standing on the edge of a pool deep pool sunk in a hollow of grey rocks surrounded by ferns and vines. The water was clear and bright, and in motion, flowing in a waterfall at the far end. It was beautiful, and he stood watching, marvelling at it, the undisturbed quality of it. Untouched it was, just as it had always been, probably. As long as the asteroid existed. Was he the first to see it? Perhaps. It was so hidden, so concealed by the ferns. It gave him a strange feeling, a feeling almost of ownership. He stepped down a little toward the water. And it was then he noticed her. The girl was sitting on the far edge of the pool, staring down into the water, resting her head on one drawn-up knee. She had been bathing, he could see that at once. Her coppery body was still wet and glistening with moisture, sparkling in the sun. She had not seen him. He stopped, holding his breath, watching her.
She was lovely, very lovely, with long dark hair that wound around her shoulders and arms. Her body was slim, very slender, with a supple grace to it that made him stare, accustomed as he was to various forms of anatomy. How silent she was! Silent and unmoving, staring down at the water. Time passed, strange, unchanging time, as he watched the girl. Time might even have ceased, with the girl sitting on the rock staring into the water, and the rows of great ferns behind her, as rigid as if they had been painted there. All at once the girl looked up. Harris shifted, suddenly conscious of himself as an intruder. He stepped back. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I'm from the garrison. I didn't mean to come poking around." She nodded without speaking. "You don't mind?" Harris asked presently. "No." So she spoke Terran. He moved a little toward her, around the side of the pool. "I hope you don't mind my bothering you. I won't be on the asteroid very long. This is my first day here. I just arrived from Terra." She smiled faintly. "I'm a doctor, Henry Harris." He looked down at her, at the slim coppery body gleaming in the sunlight, a faint sheen of moisture on her arms and thighs. "You might be interested in why I'm here." He paused. "Maybe you can even help me." She looked up a little. "Oh? Would you like to help me?" She smiled. "Yes, of course." "That's good. Mind if I sit down?" He looked around and found himself a flat rock. He sat down slowly, facing her. "Cigarette?" "No." "Well, I'll have one." He lit up, taking a deep breath. "You see, we have a problem at the garrison. Something has been happening to some of the men, and it seems to be spreading. We have to find out what causes it, or we won't be able to run the garrison." He waited for a moment. She nodded slightly. How silent she was. Silent and unmoving, like the ferns. "Well, I've been able to find out a few things from them, and one very interesting fact stands out. They keep saying that something called the Pipers are responsible for their condition. They say the Pipers taught them—" He stopped. A strange look had flitted across her dark, small face. "Do you know the Pipers?" She nodded. Acute satisfaction flooded over Harris. "You do? I was sure the natives would know." He stood up again. "I was sure they would, if the Pipers really existed. Then they do exist, do they?" "They exist." Harris frowned. "And they're here, in the woods?" "Yes." "I see." He ground his cigarette out impatiently. "You don't suppose there's any chance you could take me to them, do you?" "Take you?" "Yes, I have this problem, and I have to solve it. You see, the base commander on Terra has assigned this to me, this business about the Pipers. It has to be solved, and I'm the one assigned to the job. So it's important to me to find them. Do you see? Do you understand?" She nodded. "Well, will you take me to them?" The girl was silent. For a long time she sat, staring down into the water, resting her head against her knee. Harris began to become impatient. He fidgeted back and forth, resting first on one leg and then on the other. "Well, will you?" he said again. "It's important to the whole garrison. What do you say?" He felt around in his pockets. "Maybe I could give you something. What do I have?" He brought out his lighter. "I could give you my lighter." The girl stood up, rising slowly, gracefully, without motion or effort. Harris's mouth fell open. How supple she was, gliding to her feet in a single motion. He blinked. Without effort she had stood, seemingly without change. All at once she was standing instead of sitting, standing and looking calmly at him, her small face expressionless. "Will you?" he said. "Yes. Come along." She turned away, moving toward the row of ferns. Harris followed quickly, stumbling across the rocks. "Fine," he said. "Thanks a lot. I'm very interested to meet these Pipers. Where are you taking me? To your village? How much time do we have before nightfall?" The girl did not answer. She had entered the ferns already, and Harris quickened his pace to keep from losing her. How silently she glided! "Wait," he called. "Wait for me." The girl paused, waiting for him, slim and lovely, looking silently back. He entered the ferns, hurrying after her.
"Well, I'll be damned," Commander Cox said. "It sure didn't take you long." He leaped down the steps, 2 at a time. "Let me give you a hand."
Harris grinned, lugging his heavy suitcases. He set them down and breathed a sigh of relief. "It isn't worth it," he said. "I'm going to give up taking so much."
"Come on inside. Soldier, give him a hand."
A patrolman hurried over and took one of the suitcases. The 3 men went inside and down the corridor to Harris's quarters. Harris unlocked the door and the patrolman deposited his suitcase inside. "Thanks," Harris said. He set the other down beside it. "It's good to be back, even for a little while."
"A little while?"
"I just came back to settle my affairs. I have to return to Y3 tomorrow morning."
"Then you didn't solve the problem."
I solved it, but I haven't cured it. I'm going back and get to work right away. There's a lot to be done. But you found out what it is? Yes, it was just what the men said, the Pipers. The Pipers do exist. Yes, Harris nodded. They do exist. He removed his coat and put it over the back of the chair. Then he went to the window and let it down. Warm spring air rushed into the room. He settled himself on the bed, leaning back. The Pipers exist, all right, in the minds of the garrison crew. To the crew, the Pipers are real. The crew created them. It's a mass hypnosis, a group projection, and all the men there have it to some degree. How did it start? Those men on Y3 were sent there because they were skilled, highly trained men with exceptional ability. All their lives they've been schooled by complex modern society, fast tempo and high integration between people, constant pressure towards some goal, some job to be done. Those men are put down suddenly on an asteroid where there are natives living the most primitive of existence, completely vegetable lives, no concept of goal, no concept of purpose, and hence no ability to plan. The natives live the way the animals live, from day to day, sleeping, picking food from the trees. A kind of Garden of Eden existence, without struggle or conflict. But each of the garrison crew sees the natives and unconsciously thinks of his own early life when he was a child, when he had no worries, no responsibilities, before he joined modern society. A baby lying in the sun. But he can't admit this to himself. He can't admit that he might want to live like the natives, to lie and sleep all day. So he invents the Pipers, the idea of a mysterious group living in the woods who trap him, lead him into their kind of life. Then he can blame them, not himself. They teach him to become a part of the woods. What are you going to do? Have the woods burned? No, Harris shook his head. That's not the answer. The woods are harmless. The answer is psychotherapy for the men. That's why I'm going right back, so I can begin work. They've got to be made to see that the Pipers are inside them, their own unconscious voices calling to them to give up their responsibilities. They've got to be made to realize that there are no Pipers, at least not outside themselves. The woods are harmless, and the natives have nothing to teach anyone. They're primitive savages, without even a written language. We're seeing a psychological projection by a whole garrison of men who want to lay down their work and take it easy for a while. The room was silent. I see, Cox said presently. Well, it makes sense. He got to his feet. I hope you can do something with the men when you get back. I hope so too, Harris agreed, and I think I can. After all, it's just a question of increasing their self-awareness. When they have that, the Pipers will vanish. Cox nodded. Well, you go ahead with your unpacking, Doc. I'll see you at dinner. And maybe before you leave tomorrow. Fine. Harris opened the door and the commander went out into the hall. Harris closed the door after him and then went back across the room. He looked out the window for a moment, his hands in his pockets. It was becoming evening, the air was turning cool. The sun was just setting as he watched, disappearing behind the buildings of the city surrounding the hospital. He watched it go down. Then he went over to his 2 suitcases. He was tired, very tired from his trip. A great weariness was beginning to descend over him. There were so many things to do, so terribly many. How could he hope to do them all? Back to the asteroid, and then what? He yawned, his eyes closing. How sleepy he was. He looked over at the bed. Then he sat down on the edge of it and took his shoes off. So much to do the next day. He put his shoes in the corner of the room. Then he bent over, unsnapping one of the suitcases. He opened the suitcase. From it he took a bulging gunny sack. Carefully he emptied the contents of the sack out on the floor. Dirt, rich, soft dirt. Dirt he had collected during his last hours there. Dirt he had carefully gathered up. When the dirt was spread out on the floor, he sat down in the middle of it. He stretched himself out, leaning back. When he was fully comfortable, he folded his hands across his chest and closed his eyes. So much work to do. But later on, of course. Tomorrow. How warm the dirt was. He was sound asleep in a moment.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed these Philip K. Dick stories, hit the like button and subscribe for more narrations every Monday and Friday. Oh, and don't forget to take a look at my Patreon. There are over a dozen exclusive novelettes waiting for you there, and you'd be really helping out a passionate creator. And for another compilation by one of the great sci-fi writers, go and listen to my video of 4 short stories by Evelyn E. Smith. A link to that is on screen now.